Hi guys, my name is Sophia, and today I will be talking about the understanding of criminal profiling, the science versus the practice, and what and the look at how profiling works and what research says. So in this understanding, throughout the presentation, I'll be examining how profiling is presented and how it's portrayed, how it actually is applied to criminal investigations, and whether science truly supports its real world usage. So, an introduction and overview that I want to specify is that I want to explore the credibility, the utility, and the scientific foundation for criminal profiling. So, let me begin with a little roadmap that I want to make. First, I'll be defining how um, criminal profiling looks like, especially with this scientific advances in investigative psychology, the gaps between the academic research and the practical applications for this profiling, the strengths and limitations of profiling in criminal investigations, and the recommendations that I think should be applied. But the ultimate goal that I want to conclude is that I want the key ultimate goal is to assess whether profiling is truly a reliable investigative tool or if it's more of fiction and fact than fact. So, what is criminal profiling? So, criminal profiling is a technique used to deduce a psychological or demographic characteristic of an offender based on the behavioral evidence left at a crime scene. So it is commonly applied for serial crimes, but sometimes it will be used as for homicides and sexual assaults. And this is aims narrowly to profile, not to identify a single individual, but rather help law enforcement narrow down the suspect pool and generate investigative leads and better understand the behavioral patterns behind a series of crimes. Profiling offers potential insights of the offender's age, gender, personality traits, or even geographical habits. So, why should we study criminal profiling? So, despite there having an increased popularity in the media, criminal profiling is often misunderstood, right? So, it's often presented as one of the flawless science capable of instantly identifying who is guilty, but it doesn't really matter because profiling is very more complex than just that. And profiling is more often varies in the level of success rate. And so its reliability does fluctuate upon time. And studying criminal profiling allows to us evaluate a scientific foundation to improve application in a voice misuse that could lead to wrongful accusations or near dead end investigations. So the thesis statement that I want to require in this sense is that while criminal profiling holds promising potential for supporting investigative in criminal investigations, it is effective and highly dependent of the extent in which based of rigorous scientific findings and methodologies. When profiling is grounded with data and psychology, it assists law enforcement in meaningful ways. However, it is based on hunches and intuitions, media stereotypes, and it risks being misleading and even dangerous. The challenges lie between the transformation of profiling and the art into a science. So now we're talking about profiling in the media. So we can see one of the most successful places that you can find profiling in media is Criminal Minds, one of my great favorite TV shows. But Criminal Minds glorifies profiling. So this becomes where almost all the profilers in the media become so clairvoyant figures and capable of deducing intricate personal details just by the minimal evidence, which is not accurate, and it creates unrealistic expectations for the public and the law enforcement. And so it's very depicted, and it's more of a dramatic emphasis on media and how profiling actually works. And it's overemphasizes intuitions, and for the dramatic flares for this show often overshadows the fact that profiling must be based on um, empirical evidence, statistical analysis, and behavioral science. So now we're going to be talking about types of profiling. So there are several types of methods of profiling used today. We're going to be talking about clinical profiling. So clinical profiling heavily relies on the profiler's experience and intuition. So this means that it's more of the hunch that they have more than anything actually data based. So that's one of the more later techniques that they have used. So one of the first techniques that they were using for criminal profiling. Then we have crime scene analysis, which examines and analyzes physical and behavioral clues in the crime scene. So it would be like what tool was used during the actual incident, or what is more common than not in a crime scene. And then we have the statistical profiling. So statistical profiling requires that it's drawn from databases and how this database sees different crime scenes to add up if they are connected or not, and just analyzes trends and probabilities and possibilities if it's just one killer or an offender at this stage. Then we have geographical profiling that was discovered by Egger in 1999, and analyzes spatial location of crimes to predict where an offender might live or where they're hiding or operating. So each of these methods do have their own strengths and limitations, but they're often most effective if they're used in combination. So let's say criminal profiling with geographical profiling, or statistical profiling with crime scene analysis, or all of four of them together. So that's how you know that there's different types of um, profiling techniques. So now we're going to be talking about the actual academic versus practical application. So the gap that they have between. So a significant challenge in a criminal profiling is that there's a gap between academic research and practical application. So in a study of 2004, a study by Allison or Lawrence Allison and her colleagues, um, researchers identified ongoing tensions between academics who study profiling and the practitioners who apply it in their field. So while both um, practitioners and the researchers agree that profiling is useful, but it also acknowledges that there's limitations implied in this case. As when they were doing the survey, that 184 of law enforcement professionals found that profiling is considered the most useful, but it needs to be backed by scientific evidence and needs to be used cautiously, rather than just as a primary way of solving crime scenes. It has to be used proactively. Now we're going on to traditional profile limitations. So this involves different types of profiling. So it's more of it into intuitions and the interpretation that they have in these crime scenes. So despite the appeal of traditional criminal profiling, there's still significant limitations to this. Many of the traditional methods were built on typologies or psychological stereotypes and biases, which lack the empirical testing that they need and evidence. So this just opens doors to cognitive bias and the false assumption. For example, assuming that all serial killers are in their 30s and they are white, it assumes that they're more viable suspects. But we see that it could be different, and saying that that's not the actual type of offender that we're looking for. So it just lacks consistency and it's rarely reproducible. So in short, it's just scientific rigor, and profiling can be easily become speculative and harmful for investigations because of the stereotyping and the leading misleading assumptions. So now we're going to go on to a very famous crime profiling case where crime profiling was useful. So we'll be talking about the Mad Bomber case. So one of the most frequently cited success stories about criminal profiling is the case of Mad Bomber, or George Magnitsky, who planned over 30 bombs across New York City from 1940 to 1956. Um, a psychiatrist named Dr. James Brussel created a psychological profile that accurately predicted Magnitsky's traits, including his mental state, religious beliefs, and how he dressed. This case is often celebrated as a milestone in the history of profiling, demonstrating how psychological insights can directly contribute to solving cases. But, however, it's mostly noted that these cases are exceptional, that they should not be used to generalize the overall effectiveness of criminal profiling, but especially criminal profiling, but in traditional aspects, because Dr. James Brussel used his psychological profile under the intuition type and bias. So, an introduction to investigative psychology. So, investigative psychology was pioneered by David Cantor and Donna Youngs. So, it was presented more of a scientific and reliable alternative to traditional profiling. And it was grounded on psychological and theory and supported by empirical research, rather than focusing on intuition, how and how it emphasizes understanding of how offenders make their decisions when committing a crime, and how their actions reflect deeper psychology patterns, and how behavior can systematically and analyzed to inform police work. So, how does investigative psychology work? So, investigative psychology works with a large database or data set drawn in criminal involved cases. So, by analyzing these data sets, they're using techniques as called small space analysis, and they identify consistent behavioral traits and patterns that correlate with certain offender characteristics, such as if we use the Mad Bomber case to any other case that has the same scientific analysis and behavioral patterns. This data-driven approach allows them to construct more accurate testable profiles, reducing reliance on subject judgment by mapping behavioral patterns to psychological traits. This method provides a more constructive and structured, defensible way of profiling. So, scientific advances in investigative psychology are directed over time. Criminal profiling has evolved, especially when it comes to the rise of investigative profiling and how we use discipline, emphasis on empirical research, psychological theory, and data set analysis to draw conclusions about offenders. Rather than relying just on a gut feeling, modern profiling allows um, behavioral modeling, spatial analysis, and decision support tools to aim to identify these patterns and how it could statistically link to an offender characteristics, which shifts the mark between a critical step towards bridging the gap between profiling and evidence-based criminal investigation. Now we go on to the behavior consistency that we look for. So, um, David Cantor introduced the concept of behavioral consistency, which suggests that offenders tend to repeat their behaviors and among crime scenes. And for instance, if an offender who binds a victim in one case is more likely to do so again. These repeated actions are not random, but they reveal important psychological patterns that they have, and that could be motives, emotional triggers, or any level of control, which recognizes patterns and investigators to link other crimes to this. So it could draw a deeper conclusion if about an offender's state of mind. Now we'll be talking about the A to E equation of profiling. So the A to E equation developed by Carson and Bull stands for action equals characteristics. This model is very observable as it observes behaviors at a crime scene, which is likely traits of an offender. So for an example, a crime scene is highly organized, and the offender may be intelligent and meticulous and socially competent. This framework promotes structure and evidence-based analysis to make profiling more measurable and testable, ensuring that the traits will be used responsibly. So it's a more structural way of profiling with evidence. Now we will have to go into the strengths of criminal profiling. So some of the strengths that criminal profiling, especially since the beginning to now, when well done, criminal profiling generates a great investigative leads, and it actually benefits an investigation more than anything. And it helps generate more than just a lead, but in the crime scene and any crime. It also assists narrowing down suspect lists and make link crimes that were previously unrelated. So it links more than just one crime. And additionally, profiling also supports decisions and allocates police to resources and conducting interviews, but it doesn't replace the traditional evidence that it could provide by complementary psychological lens through which crimes are understood. And then going on to limitations of criminal profiling. So, however, we must remain cautious about criminal profiling because many profiling models, especially traditional ones, do have their rigorous scientific testing, but they still need empirical validation. And it's vulnerable to cognitive bias because it's all based on intuition. And additionally, when profiling becomes predictive of power, it suggests possibilities and not certainties. And finally, the issue is that it's inadmissible in court, so it won't be able to help a person in court, but it helps inform in the investigation. So moving on to towards evidence-based practice. So the path if forward involves embracing evidence-based practice. That means combining experiential knowledge of police officers with scientific tools and research and psychologists. Also, enforcement agencies should invest in training that emphasizes scientific methods, data interpretations, and awareness of bias. So it will lead them away from cognitive biases. And then, most importantly, profiling should never be used to directly legal evidence, but rather supplemental tools to guiding investigations. Some recommendations to improve the utility and credibility of profiling would be developing standardized profiling protocols. So this would ensure a consistency across investigations. Also, I would encourage this interdisciplinary collaboration between law enforcement, psychologists, and statisticians so that it would help them in the long run. And then must prioritize the validation of psychological tools to undergo empirical testing. So these changes can help ensure profiling and a responsibility effectively based on facts rather than assumptions. And a main takeaway that I want from this presentation is that criminal profiling has the potential to be a valuable tool in investigations, but not only be used as caution, but scientific backing and humility. We must recognize that both the strengths and the shortcomings that criminal profiling does have, but with psychology and data science, we should continue to advance this and an opportunity to reshape profiling as a more reliable way to have comprehension. And these are the references, and thank you for listening to my presentation.